Picture this. You're standing in a chamber carved from bedrock so deep beneath the Egyptian desert that the air tastes like copper and time itself. The year is 2278 BCE. You're a palace servant, pulled from your sleep by guards whose faces you've learned never to look at directly. They handed you 10 massive jars, each one sealed with wax that bears the pharaoh's personal mark, and they gave you one instruction. Bring these to the lower chamber. Ask no questions. Forget what you see. Now you're watching as other servants, silent ones, the kind with severed tongues, pour that honey in slow, deliberate streams. It catches the torchlight like molten amber, like liquid fire, cascading over skin that shouldn't be there, over a body that shouldn't exist in this context. A boy, maybe 12 years old, stands naked on a raised platform of polished obsidian. The honey moves across his shoulders, down his chest, pooling in the hollow of his throat before continuing its journey. It coats his arms, his belly, his trembling legs, until every inch of him gleams like a living statue of gold. The boy has been trained. You can see it in the rigid way he holds himself, in the mechanical control of his breathing. He doesn't speak, he doesn't cry, he doesn't even flinch when the honey, still warm from the palace kitchens, touches places that should remain private, should remain sacred. But his eyes tell a different story. They dart frantically in the torchlight, searching for something, anything, that might explain why this is happening. Why him? Why tonight? Why again? You don't know yet that this boy is the 8th in a line that stretches back 6 months. You don't know that the previous 7 are buried in unmarked graves beyond the city walls, their bodies wrapped in linen that no priest would bless. You don't know that the figure watching from the shadows, the one sitting on the chair carved from a single block of cedar, is Pepi himself, the pharaoh, the living god, the boy king who discovered that honey attracts more than just flies. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe and comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach, how far the whispers of ancient horrors can travel through time. The official records will tell you that Pepi ascended to the throne of Egypt at the age of 6. His father, Pepi the Resident, had died unexpectedly, though unexpectedly is a word that does heavy lifting in royal circles, where poison flows more freely than wine, and ambition kills more reliably than any blade. His older brother should have inherited the double crown, but older brothers have a way of disappearing when powerful uncles and desperate mothers start making calculations in the dark. So there's Pepi, barely tall enough to see over the armrest of the throne, wearing a crown that weighs more than his head, holding a crook and flail designed for a man's hands. The priests perform the ceremonies. The nobles bow. The common people press their faces into the dirt because that's what you do when a god walks among you, even if that god still wets his bed and cries for his nursemaid when thunder shakes the palace walls. But here's what the official records don't mention. What it does to a child's mind to be worshipped, to have grown men prostrate themselves before you, to learn that your slightest word can end a life, that your casual gesture can elevate a family to wealth or cast them into ruin. To understand, before you understand anything else about the world, that you're not bound by the rules that govern lesser beings. Most 6-year-olds are learning to play games. Pepi was learning that he was the game, and everyone else was just pieces on his board. His mother, Ankhezen Pepi, ruled as regent naturally. That's the official version. She guided his hand on the royal decrees, whispered advice during audiences, made the hard decisions while he learned what kingship meant. But in the palace, in the private chambers where honesty occasionally dared to show its face, everyone knew the truth. She didn't guide him. She shaped him, moulded him like clay on a potter's wheel, spinning him faster and faster until he couldn't remember what form he was supposed to take. She taught him that love was leverage, that trust was a weapon used by the weak, that every smile concealed a scheme, every gift hid an obligation, every friendship was just an alliance waiting to expire. By the time he was 10, Pepi could read the ambitions in a courtier's eyes the way other children read simple hieroglyphs. By 12, he could orchestrate a man's downfall without ever speaking a direct order. By 14, he had forgotten that there was any other way to interact with human beings. The palace in Memphis sprawls like a small city, its walls white limestone that blinds in the afternoon sun, its courtyards vast enough to hold armies. But Pepi's favourite rooms are the ones beneath, the ones accessed through passages that don't appear on any architect's plans, the ones where the walls weep moisture and the air hangs thick with secrets that have nowhere else to go. It starts innocently enough, if innocence has any meaning in a place like this. A nobleman brings honey as tribute. Nothing unusual there. Egypt runs on tribute: gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, incense from Punt, and honey from the Delta region where bees work themselves to death, producing liquid gold for pharaohs and gods. This particular honey is special, the nobleman explains, bowing so low his forehead nearly touches the floor. It's harvested under the full moon, blessed by priests infused with herbs that grant vitality and extend life. Pepi is 16 now, old enough to recognize flattery but young enough to still be seduced by it. He tastes the honey. It's extraordinary, rich and complex with undertones of flowers that don't grow anywhere in Egypt, flavors that seem to shift and change on the tongue. He orders more, much more. The nobleman bows again, promises to deliver personally, and when he does, he brings something else along with the jars, a suggestion, a whisper, a practice that the old king supposedly used, though no scribe would ever commit it to papyrus. The honey, the nobleman explains, is more than food. It's a medium, a conductor of power. The pharaohs of old would cover their bodies in it during sacred rituals, let it draw the divine essence closer, let it coat them in immortality itself. Of course, he adds carefully, the ritual works even better with a surrogate, someone young, unblemished, who could serve as a vessel for the pharaoh's spiritual essence. The nobleman doesn't say what happens to the surrogate afterward. He doesn't need to. Pepi's eyes already have that distant, calculating look, the one that palace servants have learned means someone's fate is being decided. The first ritual happens 3 nights later. They bring a boy from the palace kitchens, someone expendable, someone whose disappearance will be explained by a simple notation in the household records. Died of fever. The procedure is exactly as described. Honey poured slowly, deliberately, while Pepi watches from his cedar throne. Priests chant in a language that predates the pyramids. Incense burns in braziers, smoke curling toward ventilation shafts that lead up through hundreds of feet of stone to the desert sky. The boy endures it, survives the night, is paid in silver and sent back to his duties with strict instructions to never speak of what occurred. And Pepi feels it, or thinks he feels it, a surge of vitality, a sharpening of his senses, a connection to something vast and terrible and utterly intoxicating. It doesn't matter if it's real. It doesn't matter if it's just the power of suggestion, the placebo of ritual, the high that comes from reducing another human being to an object. What matters is that it feels like power, and power is the only god Pepi truly worships. So it happens again and again. The rituals become more frequent, more elaborate. The honey flows in greater quantities. The surrogates are chosen more carefully, young, attractive, frightened but compliant, selected from populations with no power to object. Slaves from conquered territories, orphans from the streets of Memphis, children of debtors who've sold their offspring to pay what they owe. Egypt is vast and ancient, and it grinds through human lives with the casual efficiency of a millstone crushing grain. But here's where the story shifts, where the camera pulls back to reveal the wider scope of the horror. Because Pepi isn't just indulging in private rituals for his own gratification. He's building a system, a machine designed to perpetuate his power and feed his appetites while maintaining a facade of divine legitimacy. The nobles see it first. They're invited to observe, to participate, to become complicit. A banquet is arranged in one of the palace's grand halls, columns rising toward ceilings painted with stars and gods, tables groaning under the weight of roasted geese and honeyed figs, and wine so fine it's measured by the drop. The nobles arrive in their finest linens, their jewellery glinting, their smiles fixed in place by decades of practice at concealing their true thoughts. Halfway through the evening, servants bring out the entertainment. Not dancers or musicians, at least not the kind you'd expect. Boys and girls covered in honey pose like living sculptures throughout the hall. They stand motionless on pedestals, golden and gleaming, their eyes focused on points in the distance while nobles walk between them, commenting on their form, their beauty, the artistry of their arrangement. Some nobles are horrified. Most are intrigued. A few are aroused. All of them understand the message. This is how far Pepi's power extends. This is how little the lives of common people matter. This is the price of remaining in royal favour, and one by one they accept it. Because to object is to mark yourself as weak. To express disgust is to reveal that you still cling to outdated notions of morality and restraint. The nobles of Egypt didn't survive by having principles. They survived by having flexibility, by bending whichever direction the wind blew, by becoming whatever their pharaoh needed them to be. The honey becomes a symbol, a currency. Pepi rewards his most loyal supporters with jars of his special reserve, the stuff allegedly infused with life-extending properties. Whether it actually extends life is irrelevant. What matters is that powerful men believe it might, and belief is a form of control more binding than any chain. They come to depend on it, to structure their rituals around it, to convince themselves that the honey is what keeps them vital and alive even as they watch their contemporaries age and die. Meanwhile, in the streets of Memphis, in the villages along the Nile, in the quarries where stone is cut and the fields where grain is harvested, people whisper. They don't know the details. How could they? The specifics of royal excess are kept behind walls thicker than any prison. But they sense something wrong in the air, something rotten beneath the pageantry. The pharaoh has reigned for 30 years now, and he shows no signs of aging, no signs of the weariness that should come with such responsibility. His appetites only grow. His demands become stranger. The quotas for honey production increase year after year, and the beekeeper families work themselves into exhaustion trying to meet them. And sometimes children disappear. Not many. Not enough to spark open rebellion. Just enough that mothers start keeping their sons and daughters closer, start watching the palace guards with wary eyes, start teaching their children to run if men in royal livery come asking questions. The slaves notice it too. Egypt's prosperity is built on their backs, on the Nubians, captured in southern campaigns, on the Libyans taken from the western deserts, on the Asiatics brought from beyond the Sinai. They work the quarries and the fields and the construction projects that will still be standing 4,000 years later. Monuments to glory built by hands that history will never name. They live in compounds outside the city walls, fed just enough to keep working, beaten just enough to keep compliant, killed just often enough to remind the others what happens to those who forget their place. But slaves talk to each other. They share information in the coded language of the oppressed, in glances and gestures that overseers don't understand. They know about the honey chambers. They know about the surrogates who enter and never return. They know because some of them have been chosen, have survived the rituals, have come back changed in ways that go deeper than skin. And they're starting to understand that their pharaoh, their living god, is actually just a man. A twisted, broken man who's found a way to transform his psychological damage into state policy. In the compound where the Nubian labourers sleep, pressed together on reed mats, a young man named Khalek sits with his back against the mud brick wall and tells stories. He's educated, unusual for a slave, but he was captured during a raid on a village that had its own scribe, its own traditions of literacy. He tells stories about the old gods, the ones who existed before Egypt rose to dominance, the ones who judged rulers not by their longevity, but by their justice. He tells stories about tyrants who fell, about slaves who rose up, about the natural order reasserting itself when men pretend to be gods. The overseers don't worry about Khalek. What harm can stories do? Slaves need some way to pass the time between their backbreaking shifts. Better they exhaust themselves with words than save their energy for rebellion. But the overseers don't understand that stories are how revolutions begin. They don't realize that every tale of resistance plants a seed, and seeds grow in darkness, and given enough time they burst through stone. Pepi is 45 now. He's reigned for 39 years, longer than most men live, and he looks like he's 30 at most. Whether it's the honey or genetics or the sheer force of his will to continue existing, he's aged remarkably well. But there's something off about him, something that disturbs even his closest advisors. His eyes don't quite focus on the present anymore. When he looks at people, he seems to be seeing through them to some other reality, some private theatre, where they're all just actors playing roles he's assigned. The rituals have evolved. They're no longer occasional indulgences, but scheduled events, marked on calendars kept by priests who've forgotten what it means to serve actual gods. 3 times per week, regular as the Nile's flooding, surrogates are brought to the honey chambers. The procedures have become refined, codified, transformed into religious rites with all the trappings of legitimate worship. There are prayers now, incantations, specific patterns in which the honey must be applied. Pepi insists on overseeing each ritual personally, and he's developed preferences, particular types of bodies, specific expressions of fear that he finds especially pleasing. His current vizier, a man named Smenkar, who's held power by perfecting the art of anticipating Pepi's desires before Pepi himself knows he has them, arranges everything. He maintains the supply chain that brings honey from the delta. He manages the selection of surrogates. He ensures that the evidence is disposed of properly, that the families are compensated or silenced, that the official records show nothing but routine administrative activities. It's exhausting work, but Smenkar has come to understand that his own survival depends on Pepi's satisfaction. The pharaoh has gone through 7 viziers during his reign. The previous one made a mistake, questioned whether a particular ritual was really necessary, suggested perhaps they could reduce the frequency. His body was found in the Nile 3 days later, bloated and picked over by crocodiles. But even Smenkare, skilled as he is at reading the currents of power, doesn't fully understand what's happening in Pepi's mind. The pharaoh has convinced himself that he's discovered the secret of immortality. Not metaphorical immortality through monuments and legacy, actual physical immortality through the ritualistic consumption of others' vitality. He believes the honey is a medium that transfers life force from the young to him, that each ceremony adds years to his existence, that he can continue indefinitely as long as the rituals are maintained. It's madness, obviously. Sophisticated, rationalized, bureaucratically implemented madness, but madness nonetheless. Yet it's madness with consequences that extend far beyond one man's delusions. The honey production quotas are destroying families. The selection of surrogates is creating a climate of terror. The complicity of the nobles is corroding Egypt's moral foundation from within. The entire apparatus of state power is being redirected towards serving one man's psychological needs. And in the slave compounds, Karlik is no longer just telling stories. He's organizing, teaching, preparing. He's identified others like himself, people who retain enough hope to be dangerous, enough anger to be useful, enough intelligence to coordinate action. They meet in the spaces between work shifts, in moments stolen from exhausted sleep, in places where overseers don't think to look. They discuss tactics, resources, timing, the layout of the palace, the schedules of the guard shifts, the location of the honey chambers. They don't call it revolution yet. That word is too large, too frightening, too likely to fail. They call it justice. They call it balance. They call it reminding a false god that he bleeds just like everyone else. 50 years into his reign, Pepi throws a celebration. The official reason is the completion of a new temple complex dedicated to his cult, because of course he has a cult now, with priests who teach that Pepi is not just divinely ordained but actually a god incarnate, eternal and unchanging. The real reason is that Pepi has become addicted to spectacle, to demonstrations of his power so elaborate that they numb the mind and paralyze any thought of resistance. The celebration lasts for 7 days. The entire court is required to attend. Nobles from every province travel to Memphis, bringing tribute and fake smiles, and the desperate hope that they'll survive the week without accidentally offending the pharaoh. The palace is transformed into a sensory overload, musicians playing continuously, dancers performing on every terrace, acrobats and wrestlers and trained animals parading through courtyards and everywhere honey. It flows from fountains carved to look like gods. It's poured over pyramids of fruit that servants carry on golden platters. It's painted onto the bodies of hundreds of people, not slaves this time, but volunteers, Citizens promised gold and favour for their participation in the festivities. They stand in elaborate tableaux throughout the palace, living art installations depicting scenes from mythology, historical victories, divine interventions. Some are arranged to look like they're holding up the sky. Others are posed as if caught mid-transformation into animals or gods. And all of them are covered in honey, gleaming in the torchlight, turning human beings into object, spectacle, decor. The nobles wander through this honey-coated nightmare trying to look appropriately impressed. They drink wine that's been sweetened with honey. They eat food swimming in honey. They watch performances where honey plays a central role, contortionists bending their bodies while honey is poured over them, dancers moving in patterns that leave honey footprints on the marble floors. The message is clear. Pepi controls everything, even the substances that sustain life. He can give sweetness or withhold it. He can make it a blessing or a curse. He is the source of all things, and everyone else exists only to consume what he provides. On the fifth night, Pepi announces a special entertainment. The nobles are led into a chamber they've never seen before, vast and circular, its walls carved with scenes of judgment from the Book of the Dead. In the centre, on a platform raised above the floor, stands a boy. He's perhaps 13, Nubian based on his features, and he's covered from head to toe in honey so dark it looks black in the flickering light. He stands perfectly still, and at first the nobles think he's another volunteer, another part of the living art collection. But then they notice the chains attached to his ankles, the armed guards surrounding the platform, the way Pepi watches him with an expression of hungry anticipation. The pharaoh stands and begins to speak. He talks about sacrifice, about how the old ways demanded blood to maintain cosmic order, prisoners thrown from cliffs, slaves buried with their masters, animals slaughtered on altars. He talks about how he's modernized this ancient practice, made it more refined, more civilized. He talks about honey as a transformative substance, about how it preserves what it touches, makes it eternal. And as he talks, more honey is brought out, jar after jar, and poured over the boy until he's drowning in it, until it's pooling around his feet, until he's struggling to breathe through the golden cascade. The nobles watch. Some are horrified, some are fascinated, some are aroused. Most are just terrified because they understand now, really understand, that they're not watching a demonstration of power. They're being tested. Pepi is watching them watch the boy, measuring their reactions, determining who's fully committed to his vision and who still harbours dangerous attachments to outdated morality. One nobleman, a governor from Upper Egypt who's made the mistake of maintaining his conscience, stands and tries to object. He gets 3 words out before guards grab him. He's dragged away, and everyone hears his screams echoing through the corridors until they suddenly stop. When the nobles look back at the platform, the boy is unconscious and Pepi is smiling. The celebration continues for 2 more days. No one mentions the governor. No one asks about the boy. They eat and drink and pretend enthusiasm because survival depends on performance, and they've all become very, very good actors. In the slave compounds, Kalek hears about the celebration. The details reach him through the network of servants and labourers who move between the palace and the outside world, carrying information along with laundry and garbage and food supplies. He hears about the honey fountains and the living art and the boy on the platform, and he makes a decision. They've been preparing for 2 years, gathering intelligence, acquiring tools, building an organisation. It's time to move from preparation to action. The plan is audacious to the point of suicide, which is why it might actually work. The palace guards are skilled at preventing external attacks, at maintaining security against invading armies or assassins sneaking over walls. They're not prepared for an uprising from within, from the invisible people who maintain the palace infrastructure, the servants who cook the food, the labourers who clean the chambers, the craftsmen who repair the walls. These people move through the palace like ghosts, barely noticed, certainly not perceived as threats. Kalek and his core group spend weeks mapping movements, memorising schedules, identifying the moments when security is thinnest. They cultivate relationships with sympathetic servants, people who've seen too much and retained enough humanity to be disgusted. They acquire weapons, not swords or spears, but tools that could serve as weapons if needed. Hammers, knives from the kitchen, lengths of chain. They're not trying to conquer the palace. They're trying to reach the honey chambers during one of Pepi's rituals and make him understand that he is not, in fact, a god. The night they choose is moonless. 60 slaves move through the palace in small groups, taking different routes, using passages that servants have known about for generations. They encounter guards and either avoid them or neutralize them silently. A blow to the head, a knife between the ribs, bodies hidden in storage rooms to be discovered later. They move with the precision of people who have nothing left to lose, who've seen too many of their own taken to the honey chambers and returned broken, or not returned at all. Kalek leads the main group. They reach the honey chambers just as a ritual is beginning. The guards at the entrance aren't expecting trouble from inside the palace, certainly not from people wearing servants' clothing. By the time they react, it's too late. The slaves swarm past them, pouring into the chamber like a tide that's been held back too long. The scene inside is exactly as described in whispered stories. A boy on the obsidian platform, honey being poured by silent servants, priests chanting, incense choking the air, and Pepi on his cedar throne, watching with those distant eyes, lost in whatever private reality he inhabits during these moments. The slaves freeze. They've imagined this moment, planned for it, dreamed about it. But actually seeing it, seeing their god-king reduced to this obscene tableau, creates a psychological dislocation. For a few seconds, nobody moves. The ritual continues. The priests chant. The honey flows. Then Kalek shouts, something wordless and primal, a sound that comes from 60 years of Egyptian domination over Nubia, from 30 years of Pepi's perversions, from every indignity and horror compressed into a single note of rage. The slaves surge forward. What happens next is chaos. The priests scatter. The servants drop their jars, honey splashing across the floor, making the polished stone treacherous. The boy on the platform slips and falls, landing hard enough that something cracks. Guards rush in from adjacent chambers, and there's fighting now, brutal and close, knives flashing in torchlight, blood mixing with honey on the floor. Kalek fights through the press of bodies, focused entirely on reaching Pepi. The pharaoh hasn't moved from his throne. He's watching the chaos with something like curiosity, as if he's interested to see how this situation resolves itself. He doesn't look afraid. He should look afraid. Kalek wants him to look afraid. When Kalek finally reaches the throne, when he raises his hammer and brings it down toward Pepi's skull, a guard intercepts the blow. The hammer smashes into the man's shoulder instead, and he goes down, screaming. More guards arrive. The tide is turning. There are too many guards, and they're too well armed, and the slaves are exhausted from months of preparation and years of hard labour. But they've accomplished something. The ritual has been broken. The chamber is in ruins. The honey jars are smashed, their contents spreading across the floor in golden pools that catch the torchlight like fire. The boy from the platform has been rescued by other slaves who are carrying him toward the exit, and Pepi has been forced to see his subjects as people rather than resources, as beings capable of rage and action rather than just passive acceptance. The slaves retreat. They take casualties, too many casualties. Bodies left behind in the honey chambers, people who'll be remembered by their companions but forgotten by history. They scatter through the palace, some making it back to the compounds, others disappearing into Memphis's narrow streets, a few captured and dragged to interrogation rooms where they'll tell everything they know under torture that the official records will never mention. Kalek escapes. He makes it back to the compound just before dawn, covered in blood and honey, his hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. The other slaves who made it back gather around him, and for a long moment nobody speaks. They've failed to kill Pepi. They failed to start a wider rebellion. By morning there will be reprisals, executions, torture, new restrictions designed to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. But they've proven something. They've proven that pharaohs bleed, that gods can be frightened, that the machinery of oppression can be interrupted even if only temporarily. The reprisals are worse than expected. Pepi doesn't just execute the captured slaves, he executes their families, he decimates entire work groups, killing 1 in every 10 whether they were involved or not. He increases the guard presence throughout the palace. He has the honey chambers relocated deeper underground, accessed through passages with multiple checkpoints. He doubles down on the rituals, as if by intensifying them he can erase what happened, can reassert his control over reality itself. But something has changed. The nobles noticed. They saw their god-king vulnerable, saw him shaken even if he'd never admit it. They're starting to calculate differently now, starting to consider scenarios they would never have entertained before. What happens when Pepi dies? He can't live forever, despite his delusions. He's already reigned for 55 years. Eventually biology will assert itself, and when it does, when the throne passes to someone new, there will be a reckoning. In the slave compounds, they tell stories about the night of the honey chamber attack. They embellish it, make it more successful than it was, transform it from a failed uprising into a legend. They say Khalek struck Pepi himself, that the pharaoh screamed like a child. They say the honey turned to blood when it touched the ground, that the gods themselves witnessed the events and marked Pepi for judgment. None of it's true, but truth is less important than hope, and stories provide hope when nothing else can. Years pass. Pepi enters his 60s, then his 70s. The honey rituals continue, though less frequently now. His energy is waning. His viziers run the kingdom while he retreats deeper into his private chambers, surrounded by carefully curated servants who know better than to acknowledge his increasing frailty. Egypt continues to function because bureaucracies are resilient, because systems can persist long after their creators have descended into madness. Khalek grows old in the slave compounds. His hands that once wielded a hammer against a pharaoh now shake with age. He tells his stories to younger slaves, teaching them that resistance is possible, that gods are just men with better crowns. Some of them listen. Some of them start to plan their own actions. The cycle continues. In his 94th year of reign, Pepi Thingid Neferkare dies. The official cause is old age. He simply went to sleep and didn't wake up. The unofficial truth, whispered by servants and suppressed by priests, is that he died during a honey ritual, his heart finally giving out as he watched another surrogate coated in gold. There's poetic justice in that, if you believe in such things. His death throws Egypt into crisis. He reigned so long that nobody remembers how succession works anymore. His designated heir died 40 years ago. The rival factions of nobles who've been suppressing their ambitions for decades suddenly see opportunity. Civil war seems inevitable, but the slaves don't care about succession crises. When word reaches the compounds that Pepi is dead, they celebrate. Not openly, that would be dangerous, but in the quiet ways that oppressed people mark victories. They work a little slower. They smile at each other. They remember that tyrants are mortal, that 94 years of evil still ends, that time and death remain unconquered. In Memphis, in the palace where honey once flowed like water, servants begin the long process of cleaning. They find the hidden chambers, the secret passages, the ritual rooms. They find jars and jars of honey, enough to feed the city for months. They find records too, papyrus scrolls documenting rituals, naming surrogates, calculating costs in human lives and Egyptian gold. A young priest, idealistic and naive, suggests they should preserve these records for history. His superior, older and wiser in the ways of power, orders them burned. History, he explains, is what we choose to remember, and Egypt chooses to remember Pepi Theod as a mighty pharaoh, a long-ruling monarch, a builder of temples and maintainer of Maat, the cosmic order. The records burn. The honey chambers are sealed. Within a generation, most people have forgotten the details. Within a century, they've forgotten entirely. The story becomes legend, then myth, then nothing. But the honey remains. In Delta villages, beekeepers still tell stories about the mad pharaoh who tried to achieve immortality through sweetness. They say his spirit haunts the hives, that sometimes, late at night, you can hear him whispering to the bees, trying to extract one more drop of the golden substance that promised everything and delivered only horror. And in the desert, where sand covers everything eventually, where stone monuments crumble and memory fades, there are still moments when the wind shifts and carries a scent like honey mixed with blood, like power corrupted and innocence destroyed, like every dark thing humans are capable of when they're given absolute control and 94 years to perfect their cruelties. This is the story they don't teach in schools. This is the history that makes people uncomfortable, that raises questions about power and authority, and the thin line between divine right and monstrous tyranny. This is what happens when a child becomes a god and discovers that gods don't answer to anyone. Pepi Sekou reigned for 94 years. The official records will tell you about his political achievements, his building projects, his diplomatic relations. But the unofficial truth, the whispered history that travels through generations of slaves and servants and people too low in the hierarchy to be noticed by official chroniclers, tells a different story. It tells of honey that trapped more than flies, of rituals that consumed innocence, of a boy who became a monster so gradually that nobody noticed until it was too late, of an empire that chose complicity over confrontation, that valued stability over justice, that allowed one man's perversions to become state policy, because challenging them would have required courage that most people don't possess. The honey chambers are gone now, buried under centuries of sand and deliberate forgetting. The slaves who fought back are unnamed in any official history. The surrogates who died on obsidian platforms have no monuments, no graves marked with their names, no acknowledgement that they ever existed. But stories persist. They move through time like underground rivers, hidden but never quite dried up. And sometimes, when people look at ancient Egypt, at its magnificence and mystery, at the pharaohs who claimed divinity and the monuments that promised immortality, they should remember to ask the question that makes history uncomfortable. What horrors were committed in the name of glory? What price did others pay for Egypt's golden age? The answer is written in honey and blood, in the spaces between official records, in the silences that history refuses to fill. And the lesson, if there is a lesson in stories this dark, is that sweetness can conceal poison, that power corrupts with patience, and that the longest reigns are not always the greatest. Pepi, the boy king who became a god who became a monster, ruled for 94 years. Every one of those years cost someone their innocence, their freedom, their life. The honey he demanded is long since consumed or rotted away. The empire he maintained has crumbled. The gold he accumulated is scattered or stolen. But the memory persists, in the whispered stories, in the uncomfortable questions, in the reminder that gods who demand honey should always be asked what else they're hiding, and kings who claim immortality should always be reminded that death comes for everyone, eventually, no matter how many lives they consume trying to outrun it. This is the dark scandal of Pepi, not just what he did, but what everyone else allowed. Not just his perversion, but an entire civilization's complicity. Not just one man's madness, but the systematic machinery that enabled it. Remember it. Remember them. Remember that history has voices that official records refuse to preserve, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that make us most uncomfortable to hear. The honey has dried, the chambers have crumbled, the pharaoh is dust. But the warning remains: beware of leaders who demand sweetness. Question those who claim to be gods, and never forget that power, given enough time and enough silence, will always reveal its true nature. Always.